Welcome to the Professional Technical Interviewee. I'm Taylor Dorsett. In my 6-year career in technical recruiting, I realized that just about every company does technical interviews differently. Many very good senior engineers do not do well in technical interviews, despite being great developers. The only way to get better at interviewing is to practice. Many early career engineers don't really know what a technical interview is like until they're in their first one. Our goal here is to change that and shed some light on the technical interview. My guest today is Mike Bosch. He has an impressive resume, including Google, Uptake, and ServiceNow. He's currently the VP of Engineering at Torch, and he's hiring. I hope you enjoy this episode. Mike, welcome to the show. I guess today is Mike Bosch, currently VP of Engineering at Torch. Before that was senior manager at ServiceNow, also an alumni of Uptake and Google, and then a whole slew of startups before that in the Bay Area. How are you?
Doing good, thanks. How's your day going?
Good. It's classic Friday software development, right? So we had a fire that was able to put out. Hopefully nothing explodes by the end of the day, right?
Well, at least it's not on a Saturday.
Yeah. Great. Well, can you share a little bit about your current role and kind of the company Torch right now?
Yeah. So I've been at Torch for about 6 months. It's a really early stage startup. We're seed round at this point. And we're in the logistics space. We're basically a 3PL broker, digital broker, and we're trying to go after a problem that a lot of brokerages don't tend to tackle, which is the shorter freight, the shorter hauls. And we see this as a large scale or largely a data and data integration type of problem. So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. We worked together, obviously, when I was in recruiting and getting you connected to Torch. It's kind of an interesting space that a lot of people don't think about. It's definitely one of those, unsexy problems and very Chicago to be like freight and freight tech focused. But I think a space that is really rife for innovation, especially in the data space. It's just, there's so much that can be done. And I think, Torch is an example of what will be done over the next 5 to 10 years that will just blow people's minds when they realize like, oh, we were still doing things, faxing over term sheets or something for all these loads or something like that can be automated completely, right?
Oh yeah, we get some crazy stuff. We'll get emails with screenshots of spreadsheets, like with capacity. EDI is still big in this space. So yeah, there's a lot of I'll call it old school tech, but it's still relevant, it still works, but yeah, it's not something that you typically see on a day-to-day basis normally.
Sure. And then what is your role specifically, and then kind of the team? I know it seems like you're building out the team now.
Yeah. So I'm still technically the only engineer here. There's 7 of us now. Most of it's on the actual freight ops side. I'm in the process of hopefully, crossing my fingers, having our first data scientist come on board pretty soon. That was the one area where I don't have as much background in, so I wanted to get that in the door. And then, we're starting to hire now back end or full stack engineers. It's a little easier to be flexible in the beginning. It's like I can use a lot of different things. We'll figure it out, as we go.
Yeah. And Java tech stack?
Yeah, we're JVM, and I'm looking at expanding that to Kotlin, possibly as well for backend, and then Postgres and for the backend for the database right now, and React on the front end.
Nice. I'm curious on the technical interview side of things. I know I'm trying to remember. It wasn't a super complicated technical interview joining Torch, and if I remember correctly, you weren't like actively looking, right? So have you done technical interviews recently? And I know obviously you've done a lot of interviewing yourself, right? Interviewing candidates.
Not really. Like it would have been actually the when I went to ServiceNow and I interviewed at a couple other companies at the same time. That was almost 2.5 years ago, probably. So yeah, I haven't been doing them. Yeah, I haven't been doing them myself for a while.
Yeah. but interviewing lots of people at, it seems like ServiceNow quite a bit, and then also at Torch.
Yeah, yeah. ServiceNow, a lot of intern candidates, a lot of newer grads, as well as just general senior folks for the persistence group I was in. We were expanding pretty lot there. So like, I was probably averaging 2 or 3 interviews a week then.
Oh wow! And if I remember, I think you said your time at Google, you did what, over 100 interviews while you were there?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was, and then I also taught interviewing there as well. So like basically, you had to be an interviewer at Google. You had to go through interviewer training, and then you had to go through like shadowing and all. They had a pretty documented process for how you became a certified interviewer.
Interesting. Very different than I'm sure some startups you worked in the past, which is, oh,
Yeah.
you're the most senior person, your job now, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's I'm the only one interviewing right now, so very different than I'm basically the interview coordinator, the interviewer, and everything. That'll change, but it's all good.
Yeah, cool. Well, what are you typically evaluating for when you're looking for someone for your team?
I look a lot at culture fit, it's kind of, in some ways it can be a dirty word too sometimes because but it's really like, is it finding, it's looking for somebody that's going to fit in well with the team, that is, it's going to be a net positive on the team that people want to work with. It's not going to create unnecessary, what's the right word? Drama, I guess.
Sure.
I've had teams in the past where I've had to make structural changes because of that, and every successful team I've worked with has been, we've had that, what they called once at Google, the guy that used to run HR there, Laszlo, I forget his last name, but one of the studies that his group had come out with was like one of the more successful traits of teams was where the team members felt they had psychological safety, and that was the ability to bring up ideas and not feel like they were going to be attacked for them or ridiculed or whatnot. And so, when that came out, and I look back at some of the teams I've managed or been on, and those were the most successful ones. Where you didn't have that fear if you brought up an idea. And so I screen a lot for those kinds of traits.
Yeah.
I also look for problem solving. Like how do they approach a problem? Do they scope it properly? Do they break it down in somewhat of a systematic way, and so forth? And I tried to also evaluate how they deal with incomplete information. We rarely get complete information on the problem we're solving. Are they good at flushing that out? And then there's technical skills too. But if they don't have those other traits, I don't think they'll necessarily be a net positive on the team. So I kind of screen that way first.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think when folks are preparing for interviews, like I got to cram for different types of questions. I got to make sure I can answer X, Y, and Z. But often it's like, that's the stuff that can usually be taught on the job, right? Is like you don't have to have all of that coming in the door, but it's, can you actually fit in well with this team, right? Certainly you have to hit a certain bar from a technical perspective, but the culture fit, it does seem like more and more important. And I don't know, different than the days of old where if you were a good programmer, it didn't matter whatsoever.
Yeah.
Seems like that's changed.
Yeah, I mean, software has changed a lot. I've been at this longer than I probably want to say on camera, but it's it definitely used to be much more like if you can code, we'll get you in the door, and personalities didn't really matter as much, I guess. And it's hard to say, but yeah, it's what we build nowadays is different. We tend to interact with people from other teams a lot more, and either like business side, if you will, or users, and so you have to be able to communicate more. So I think there is more value in those soft skills.
Yeah, you said culture fit is kind of a weird stigma or whatever around it. I like the term culture add because I think that's like every addition to the team. Like obviously you want them to fit in well, but also they're bringing a certain aspect of themselves to it, and I think that kind of culminates whenever I was building teams in the past. What I was trying to do was, yes, I want this person to fit in so they don't feel isolated, but what are they also bringing to the table during this, which is always a factor, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I like to try to figure out like what my team is missing. Like when I'm interviewing for people, like, is there a certain like trait that's missing? Like, do we need a strong, like, you don't want everybody that always like is agreeable. You want people that know how to challenge an idea or ask good tough questions. And like, if you're missing that, you want to try to maybe find that kind of person. If you have too many of those, maybe you don't want another one of those people. It can be tricky. And I don't try to over optimize. I mean, I do my best not to try to over optimize for that, but it's I do think teams that have different viewpoints and find someone that brings a different viewpoint, maybe it's their background or where they work, their domain or something. Like, I find that really interesting too, because maybe we're not in finance, but they have some finance background. Like, the perspective of what they had to optimize for can be a really nice value add if the rest of the team doesn't have that. So they'll ask.
Yeah. I'm curious, have you seen an uptick? And probably in the last 5 years, certainly at ServiceNow and probably even Uptake, you interact with more like career changer, bootcamp graduate type folks than maybe, in years past when you were interviewing. Did you find it was easier to maybe see a variance in backgrounds, or has it been similar throughout your career?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. When you said that, I kind of immediately thought about one of the folks that I had on my team at ServiceNow who came from a boot camp background, and we had a few others, and most of them though were younger folks that had maybe graduated from college or maybe didn't, and now that I think about it, and but they hadn't like found their footing like career wise yet, and the boot camp was like, well, this looks interesting, and I'll give it a shot. And for them, it turned out to be a really good choice. And so I did see some like interesting degree like backgrounds. Like, some of them were math, which seems like it would translate pretty well. And I had one that came in with a philosophy degree as well. And I think that one actually translates over pretty well also. But I've seen people come from like communications backgrounds that need to switch. But yeah, I haven't seen too many people like mid-career. I know they're out there because I've seen profiles, but I don't think I've interviewed any.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was surprising to me the number, surprising to me when I first joined the coding bootcamp, helping people get their first job, was the number of people who were very qualified, had like master's degrees in some other area, but then realized, they were 5-6 years into that career and probably 8 years of training into that career and went, oh, I don't love library management or whatever it is, right? And also, I'm never going to make more than 65 grand a year. Like, is there something else I can do? And a lot of musicians, a lot of teachers, I think, were in the same boat. We're like, I love this thing, but maybe I don't have to make money from it, right?
Yeah. And I think it's also tough if they're invested in a career already, and and maybe depending on what they're coming from, they may not have to take a pay cut, but if they start over, but yeah, they may get a pay bump as well, just making that shift too.
Sure.
But I think, that comes up sometimes as well, depending on what they're coming from. But I would have no qualms though. I'd basically be assessing them for what they bring to the table. But some of those other skills and other viewpoints can be valuable. So.
Totally. Do you have a standardized system when you're doing technicals that you're trying to use, or does it change depending on the role and the individual?
There's a little bit of both, I think. There's a relatively standard structure that I tend to use, and normally when I'm in a larger company, it's whatever their structure is. Here right now, I do a phone screen initially. I try to get like a 30-minute call where it's a little bit of both of us understanding what we're each looking for. This is the role we're looking for, or this is like where we need someone to come in to do. This is what Torch is doing. This is kind of like our outlook on things. And then what's that person looking for? What's important to them? I'm still trying to, on that one, like I don't feel like I'm necessarily, well, let me back up a sec. Like, I can filter people out on that, but the number of people that tell me no, they're not interested is like practically zero. And that kind of surprises me sometimes.
Interesting.
I kind of wish that I'm like, how do I make the funnel get smaller on their end as well, from their direction, But anyway, after that one, if both parties want to continue, then it's usually like a 90-minute interview is kind of what works well for me right now. It's just I'm the only technical person, it's me. And that's usually like working through a problem. I really like to talk to them about a project that they have a large hand in. Like a favorite project typically, and then find out what their role was on it, and then start digging in, asking questions. I like to ask a lot of why questions, like, why did you take that route? Was that your decision? Did you make that decision? Would you have done it differently? And it helps kind of flesh out a lot of things without getting, and it gives, it lets them kind of talk about themselves too, which also I think helps kind of relax them. Because ultimately, I'm looking for someone who's going to be a great team member, not necessarily somebody who just interviews really well.
Sure.
So, and then after that, typically I'll have them talk to the founder if I think that they'd be a good fit, because these first few hires are going to be important. They're going to be also interacting with the founder a lot. And so they've got to, I want the founder to to meet them, as well as them to meet the founder and make sure that they're, that they also both think it's a good fit. So I'd rather somebody short circuit, before you get somebody in the door, when it's a lot more painful to separate from either direction. So.
Yeah, absolutely. What comes to mind when you say trying to get people almost like to self-filter, right? If it's the right role for them or not. And certainly that's more important, or maybe more important to make sure that they actually understand the role, right? At a smaller company or growing company, right? What I used to do was basically tell candidates that I was interviewing when I was recruiting for my own recruiters back in the day was, I think you could be a good fit, and basically lay out all kind of what the role and what everything looks like. So if you're interested, like, why don't you give me a call on Friday and we'll talk through next steps, and basically put it on them. I don't know if this is a perfect practice, but it was like an interesting thing to see people who, I would say I had 20% who on Friday wouldn't give me a call, and then I'd follow up on Monday and go, "Hey, just following up, didn't hear from you, just to check in." And then probably 20% would say, "Oh, I'm checking out some other company," or something like that. It worked for my purposes, because like if they don't want to give me a call, then they probably weren't that excited about it, and maybe I gave them an easy out, right? Versus them just saying, "I'm excited."
I mean, that's an interesting approach. I had not really considered that or thought about that, but I may give it a shot and kind of see what the signal rate on that is. I mean, I've had some candidates who abruptly kind of like canceled, and then I said, "Okay, well, let me know when you want to reschedule," and then they don't, call back, and I figured, they just didn't, they weren't ready. It wasn't a great fit for them. So I'm like, that's fine, because it's. I think sometimes it's like, well, for the candidate, they don't necessarily think it's that much of a time sink for them, and so they'll just continue on.
Yeah.
And then at the end they'll decline. I'm like, hey, it kind of wastes both of our time at that point. So I in some ways I try to give the actual cons. Like I don't try to like paint over anything, because I'm hoping that it's like, hey, you'll see that it's not the right fit for you. If it's not, you'll say so. And some of that's from personal experience. I went into a job once where I thought I'd ask good questions, and I get in there and I find out, like, no, I didn't ask good questions, or like they didn't volunteer what they should have volunteered, details about the job, and I was like, oh, this was a mistake.
Yeah. So the ones you learn from the most, right? Where you go, okay, well now I got to ask about this.
No, that was like third job in my career, or fourth job. I don't remember. It was still relatively early, and you learn a lot from the mistakes. So
it's you get different responses, but I usually ask some version of like, what isn't good? Like what wouldn't I be interested in about this job? And you'd be surprised how honest people are, or if you see them go and like kind of brace that they give you a soft answer, you're like, maybe I should ask the next person I talk to as well and see what types of answers you get. But I'd be curious to keep me informed if that question works for engineers, because salespeople, I think, were more willing to give me a call. I don't know if engineers might not be. In the back
of my head, that was part of it too. And also big, engineers are in so much demand right now as well that, it's almost like they may or may not give you a call back, even though they could be a good fit. So it's like, I don't know. But yeah, I'll give it a shot though. I like to experiment and see what works.
Yeah. How do you think in the past you've done at technical interviews as far as your own personal performance?
So I think I do really well on. Well, I'll start with where I do well, where I fumble sometimes. I think so. I tend to do really well, like on the design questions and the what was the other one? I was thinking about this. It was oh yeah, so like troubleshooting and design. I tend to do really well on, and that's like the feedback I've gotten in the past as well, from folks like after I got work. I think that where I stumbled at times is sometimes the coding moves, and it's more psychological than anything else. Like the ones where like they didn't want to necessarily proceed is where like I just stumbled and kind of I became my own worst enemy. So,
Okay.
but yeah, so overall, I think I do. I mean, my track record should be pretty good. It seems like when I look back at it, but
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Where like sometimes there is a psychological block in interviewing, especially if you're not doing it super regularly, right? A lot of people, you take an interview every 6 months, maybe once a year, unless you're like actively interviewing for something. Like you might just have a conversation, and even then, you might not have a technical, right? And then all of a sudden, you're tossed into one where you're like, oh, I could do this if I had, uninterrupted time and could sit down and look at stuff. But under this like weird spotlight, it just becomes oddly stressful, right?
yeah, and those experiences have really led me to re-examine how to interview. Because like
Yeah.
I said earlier, like I'm really trying to find someone who's going to be a net add. I want somebody who's going to make my team better and just be a good teammate, not someone that interviews well. And so I've tried to like re-examine that and figure out like how can I interview where I learned that question, what's important for me to look for that helps me answer that question.
Yeah.
And coding on a whiteboard doesn't necessarily tell me that, or there's take-home problems, but I don't want them to be too big because I don't want to ask a candidate to spend 3 or 4 hours on something. I
Yeah.
think that's, I don't think that's fair either. I don't think that's the right approach. You'll end up filtering out good candidates probably too, or good potential teammates because they don't want to spend 3 or 4 hours on a baby. And so, and that's why I've spent time re-examining like what's a good way to filter out on that. So like elite code problems and stuff, like I don't think are great indicators. It tells me you've seen that kind of problem before, but if you're trying to do that in the real world, you're going to look up what other people have done. You're going to think about it. You're going to talk it over with people. You're not going to do it on the spot with somebody kind of hovering over you, kind of, So yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a system that you've used in the past to break down like technical interviews? Because I know you said, that was when you're at like doing a whiteboarding type problem, right? That's something where maybe you're your own worst enemy there. And I feel like sometimes people use like, maybe I have this approach, right? And there's lots of different, there's a star method and a whole bunch of different things that people use. But do you have anything that you fall back on?
Yeah. It's kind of like my troubleshooting framework in a way. I kind of use it like for a lot of problems. And, it's basically like, for the first step for me is making sure I understand the problem. Like I'm prone sometimes to zone in on a word or something that I hear, like, oh, that gives me an idea, and I may miss a sentence or two, or maybe maybe the interviewer flubbed the question. I've gotten nervous or just spaced out and asked the question before too, and so I want to make sure that I understand the problem. So I'll kind of repeat back what I heard and make sure that I'm trying to solve the problem that they've actually asked me. So like understanding the actual problem. Like if it's a troubleshooting problem, like let's say there's a system outage or something like that. There's the added thing of where I want to find out the scope of the problem too. And this can be like a design problem too, like figuring out like what are we really designing, or do they just want me to kind of like take point in, because that tells them of what I'm interested in too. Like if I focus on the large system design versus some smaller component. And then, at that point, I kind of work backwards, figure out what I know, what I don't know, and then start to kind of work through what I know, and then use that to kind of push into the areas that I don't know and try to solve them. And then the other things I also try to be really conscious of is when I do start like to either discuss the solution or what I think is the solution, is kind of say why. I never want to make it one look like I'm guessing. I want to say this is, I think it's this because of this and that. For one, it shows that I'm actually thinking about it, not just guessing. But two, that it usually tends to then open up that dialogue for both of us to kind of talk through the problem.
Yeah.
And I find the candidates that, from my end as an interviewer, that I like the best is that are the ones where I do find that dialogue, because that helps me kind of explore what it's going to be like to work with them.
Yeah.
So I kind of try to do from the other end if I'm the interviewee. So yeah, that from there. I mean, that's pretty much the framework the mental framework at least.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think that's something that is so difficult for a lot of people to do, but also so important, is like being able to look at it like you're both kind of approaching this problem together, rather than like, oh, I have to do this all on my own and this person's judging me, right? Like, even if it's just mentally, those are two huge changes, right? And really difficult to do if you don't know the individual you're interviewing with, right? Especially if they're having a bad day and cranky, right? Like, it could all bad contributing factors.
Yeah. Well, and I hope companies don't put interviewers that are particularly cranky in front of candidates. But I mean, because even folks that might fit into that mold more, even those I've seen are generally, but they're not. Most people aren't looking to shoot someone down in an interview.
Sure.
And so I think if you can find that way to have that dialogue or ask good questions, that I think it goes a long way. So.
Yeah. Great. Do you have any tips or advice for people who are stepping into technical interviews? I mean, obviously that seems like a good system to help people break things down, but any advice?
Well, I mean, kind of adding on to the previous question, I think, when you're asked questions, like, always try to support them. Like, even before, like, I try to support them really before I'm asked. Like, rather, I try not to have why do you think it's that way? I mean, they're going to ask those questions, but like, I'll be like, well, I think it's this, because I think we should transfer things across the network in 20 megabyte chunks, because 1 megabyte seems too small, because you'd end up with, you're sending more packets than you need, and you can get through a megabyte of data really quickly on the other side. But 200 megs, it's too much. There's lots of reasons, but you can start to say why you're thinking something right away. And I think it without them even necessarily thinking about it, they're like, okay, this person's really thinking about the problem. They're not just throwing a number out there or an answer out there. So I think that's one piece of advice. I think the other one is come with good questions. Don't think about what's important to you. And ask those questions. And think of it really as a two-way street with the interviewer. And you'd be surprised. When we come back to kind of see what everybody thought, so we'll talk. A lot of times we'll talk about what questions they asked.
Interesting.
I know I've been in some companies where that never comes up, and other companies where it comes up a lot. And but more importantly, you want to find out, is this a good fit for you? If you're in the engineering field right now, it's a really good place to be. Look for the company that you think is going to be a good fit, and know yourself going in, like what's important to you. Look back at the jobs that you've enjoyed or been successful at. How did they differ from places where you were unhappy, and try to figure it out. And then, those are the two things that kind of pop to mind first.
Yeah, I think such as a little bit on what you mentioned earlier, right? Where like sometimes it can be candidates will continue with the process even if they're not interested, right? And I do think it's being able to be comfortable saying like, oh, I'm not interested in moving forward, right? And having an actual reason why, rather than just going, maybe I'm interested in this company, we'll see as we go on. Like, trying to figure that out as soon as possible, right? Because interviewing, it takes a lot of time on both sides of the table, right?
Yeah. I've gotten, that's something I've done more in the last 5 or 10 years, where it's just like, I'm not interested right now, and it's not a good fit for me. So.
Yeah, totally. Great. Would you say you have the same advice for early career engineers, or maybe anything different for people who are kind of just starting or just within the first couple of years of their career?
I think it's most of the same, although I would emphasize even more on the figure out what good questions to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's funny. Like I said, I've done a lot of intern interviews and early grad interviews, and I kind of start to hear the exact same questions over and over again. And it's like, okay, I can tell that you've had a recent class in how to interview, and it said, here, ask me this question, like, how would you define success in this role? I mean, you're not going to get a good answer out of that. You're not going to get a useful answer asking that question. Think about it from another direction. Like, what if you're going to ask a question like that because you're trying to figure out. I want to kind of understand the person's motivation, but like, if you're curious if you would be successful there, ask them what successful people have done, or what are some of the traits that their favorite engineers to work with have if you're going in for an engineering position, like, think about the question, think about what you want to get at, that's all. But
yeah, that's interesting. The way you phrase that almost seems like it's a better idea to ask a question that you're genuinely, something you're genuinely curious about hearing on an engineer's opinion on, rather than just, I need this default response from this company, which that may be helpful if you figure out what success looks like at that company. But it's like you said, it's not really going to impress someone, and they're going to go back saying, oh, they asked questions, but they were, the same four that everyone asks.
Yeah. And I remember after you've heard this so often, you're kind of really ask me something, and I actually remember the ones that asked me good, interesting questions, so it helps kind of like me remember you as well. So
sure. Yeah. I think everything you can do to make it more conversational, right? And like, what does success look like in this role is very unconversational. Like, it just doesn't feel like a thing I'd ever ask in real life, right? Versus, I think sometimes even, I know if I have an extra couple minutes in an interview setting, I'll just be like, you got any plans this weekend? Something like that could just like open the door to like, oh, this isn't just a candidate who's sitting here, this is actual human, right? And like someone who's, you stumble into a conversation or you actually make a meaningful connection with someone instead of just getting the rote responses and then being on your way, right?
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. I've found interesting things out from people asking similar questions. It's difficult these days because we're always, so often now it's one of the messages is, don't ask the question unless it's meaningful to the job. And so, which I completely agree with that because, it helps keep people from asking questions that might be perceived as finding a bias or something like that. And I think that's a good thing that we don't ask like bad questions like that. But at the same time, it's like, also, like you said, you maybe want to find something that also pulls them out of their shell a little bit too, because they might be nervous and so forth. So, yeah. One thing I did think about though is when we were just chatting, there was some of the other questions that they can ask is if they're curious, like, why do you stay? What keeps you here? When we're in a field like this where there's a lot of demand for engineers, you have a lot of options, a lot of choices. It's why do you stay? What do you enjoy about the job? And there's not. I had one company that I was leading engineering team for. We had a really low attrition rate, but we had optimized for people that needed a good work-life balance. We didn't need to have people working crazy hours, and so we optimized for that. And so that the answer given when people ask that question was typically, I have a really good work-life balance here that we don't do. We don't do like crunch time and stuff like that. For some people, that's great, and other people, they don't care. They're more optimized for something else. So,
yeah. I asked that question a lot when I was in recruiting. If someone had been there a number of years, I'd say like, hey, why'd you stick around for so long? Maybe that was more of a recruiter way to ask it. And then if someone had just recently joined within the last couple of years, like, what brought you there, right? And kind of what excites you about that company. Especially if someone's been at a company for 7 years, that's one where there's definitely a reason. Right?
Yeah. Especially with the way things are, right? Have been for the last, gosh, it's been a while since I was really a dip. Like,
.com era.
Yeah, 2000 I was in the Bay Area, and I went out there in 2000, and then the dip hit in early 2001, I think, is when it
Mhm.
really, and yeah, but there was a little bit of it. Yeah, there was somewhat of a dip in 2008, but relatively speaking, it wasn't bad, especially compared to other fields. So.
Yeah, I think if you weren't working at a prop trading shop, you're probably doing all right.
Yeah,
Uh,
if you were in the mortgage industry, it was a bad time.
yeah, I always heard in recessions or when there's not as many jobs, that's when engineers go to get their master's degrees, right? So you see a whole lot of people right around that 2000 time when they went back to school.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought of it from that. I'm gonna start looking at master's degrees and see when they got them. So yeah.
Look around Chicago, how many DePaul masters
I
graduates right around
do see a lot
2002.
of the Paul Masters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Cool. Well, before we move on to the technical side, any interviewing horror stories from either side of the table that you're willing to share? Maybe people can commiserate with.
So I haven't had too many where I was the interviewee. Like I've had like ones that I flubbed, like I said, the technical coding ones and stuff. Um, Trying to remember, like nothing. I figured if I had anything that was truly horrible, it wouldn't. I definitely from the other end. And like I've had some candidates got, who got so flustered when they kind of had those where they couldn't figure out an answer to something. I've had a few start to cry,
Oh wow.
which like it's it's. I mean, obviously it's awkward for them.
Yeah.
And it can be awkward for me, but it's definitely worse on their end if they've gotten to that point. So it's then it becomes more of a let me help you try to work through this and you know save face, if you will. Obviously it hasn't gone well if we got to that point.
Sure.
But I don't want it to be. I don't want them to leave just completely horrible. I'm going to try to help them recover a little bit too. I've seen that from other candidates as well, not where I wasn't interviewed, but I've had other fellow interviewers come out and like, yeah, I just asked them about like how would they do something, and they started to cry. And so,
Yeah.
but I've seen that more recently. Like that was extremely rare a long time ago, and I'm not sure what's driving that shift. I felt like the person who did it with me was much more. They just felt like they had put a lot of pressure on themselves. And it was a well-known company. I think they probably I really want to get in, and when it wasn't going well, they just didn't know how to handle it. So, but yeah, that's rough. I don't know. In those situations, though, it's not that you necessarily ask, but like it's like my advice to folks if they feel that they're that type is they're probably folks that also have test anxiety.
Sure.
And because I know some folks with that, and we've talked about it. Like, why do you think you have that? Like, I don't necessarily. And I think it's perspective because it's always like, look, there's always more opportunities out there. There's so many different places. Don't let one of them, don't let them affect you that much. But
Yeah. Totally. I think it's especially with larger companies or well-known companies, it's so easy to get wrapped up in the kind of the emotional aspect too of like, I'm so excited about this. And you almost start building up this thing in your head of like, I can't wait to work there. And then you can feel it all come crashing down in seconds, right? When you realize, oh, this problem isn't going well and it's not going to go well, right? And like, I understand how that can go south pretty quickly, right? I think very unfortunate, but I think some of the best interviewers that I've interviewed with in the past, like they can take terrible interviews and then try to take them into teaching moments where they go, hey, like I'm happy to like, let's walk through this or let's talk through this. So like you said, at least there's some positive experience from it where they go, oh, okay, now I think I get how to solve this problem in the future. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually, when it's not going well, like rather than let it be awkward, I do something similar. It's like, okay, well, let's just walk through what you could have done, and and if it's a coding problem, it's like, okay, like the one we talked about before the podcast, like you can break it down this way. There's another way you can look at it, and we both kind of know it's not going well, but it helps them kind of get through that, and maybe maybe they'll be able to take something away from it that helps them the next time. So, learn a lot of these coding problems. If it's based on what you've observed or what you've seen, it's kind of like that. It's your experience, and so maybe that kind of helps them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's take a break, and then we come back. We'll move into the technical, and hopefully I won't cry today.
Sure, sounds good.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcasting app at The Professional Technical Interviewee. I want to thank my guest and my wonderful editor and producer, Dustin Bays. If you're interested in sharing your technical interview advice and being on the show, please reach out at dorsetttaylordev@gmail.com. As a reminder, this interview has 2 parts. You can find the second half, which is the live technical interview, on YouTube at The Professional Technical Interviewee. The link will be in the show notes. Until next time, keep practicing.